I had a longer walk. So thank you for that. That was really great. So I was really struck by your comment about immature data, because I think that goes back to this whole expectation from a patient perspective, but also in driving the whole value discussion. There's none of the randomized clinical trials we've done and the evidence we have has any patient-reported outcome data in it or things that are meaningful to a patient. So if my tumor shrinks, what does that mean to me? So if I'm going to pay for something, I need to recognize that it has some value, back to your chart. So we don't have the data really to make those value decisions, do we?
No, and I think that's a really great point. Typically, drugs that are launched with solely phase 2 data alone have to have some sort of quality of life benefit, or regulators won't give them the benefit of the doubt to put it on the market. So very commonly, they have some sort of quality of life metric that allows them that market access. Now, whether a payer wants to pay for quality of life measured by a FACT scale or some other utility instrument is something that I'm not best to answer. But I know that even in Europe, quality of life does not drive pricing. It does not drive majority of access situations. Quality of life is very central to the patient, but how do you measure things like alopecia? Diarrhea and vomiting are cheap, but they're something that would impact you very much. So I think it's about the perspective. Value is all about the perspective.
Alexis Lee, newcomer. You gave a really provocative talk that I thought was wonderful, and unfortunately left me with too many questions. I think that's why we're all pausing. Let's come back to your statement about patent law and how it protects innovation, which I fully agree with. What pharmaceutical firms get in addition to patent protection then is market protection, because as you pointed out, it has to be paid for. Their product does not have to compete for price. So in order to balance that, should we remove their patent protection? They get guaranteed price, but they don't get to protect their product as long, and then encourage competition, which may encourage more either look-alike compounds that could be priced cheaper, or in fact might even have people directly copying that. I don't think that's going to be very likely in biosimilars because of complexity. So should we balance and take one of those away, because this market is distorted for both patent protection and guaranteed payment? Which one should we try and balance or get rid of?
I think it's a really compelling question, and one I don't know if I'm the best person to answer. I know that one of the most productive and successful pursuits in probably the last few centuries has been the American patent system that has encouraged innovation and people to come because they can earn for their rewards. That's the American way. That's what we do here. We gamble, we go big, and then we go home with some profit. So the pricing thing, I think, is being addressed by other levers within the system. So if you think about the life cycle, the competitive issues, the way that ASCO is dealing with oncology in the value assessments, I think there's some things we could be done to speed biologics entry a little bit more, and costs will come down. They undoubtedly do. But I don't know if I could say, I would say one of those is probably less, or let's say less important, and I'd be willing to sacrifice it. I think that it, again, would come down to preemptive decisions by CMS to provide leadership. There's data that I didn't show that showed that about 50% of US spending, health spending, is now coming from the government. And in most markets, especially global markets, European markets, that 50% is about the turning point when they realize that they're the ones who have the most skin in the game. So over the next 10 years, I could see something change. And instead of that guaranteed price protection, I would just see something a little different come vis-a-vis the other levers.
One thing about patent protection, though, if I invent a new water faucet, the consumer can say, wow, fancy water faucet, but it's still too much money, I'm not going to buy it. But in the medical world, all I used to say is, wow, fancy faucet, somebody else will pay for it for me now. And that's the imbalance I think we've got to, that's the distortion in the market that I'm not sure is going to bring us the price reduction you're talking about.
And you know, it may not, but if you look at where patents have been violated, so look at medicines in the developing world, look at vaccines, look at antibiotics where they've had different programs. This has completely destroyed the architecture and the investment case for a lot of these therapy areas. So I think it's very dangerous. Again, I don't have a counter. The only other system in the world that I can think of that has this whole agent issue, where the user is not the decider, is not the payer, is in children's toys, where the actual ultimate user of the product is not somebody who makes a decision or pays for it. That said, it's not as grave of a situation. And so I don't think the analogy works for earpiece.
Patty Gans, UCLA. I just want to go back to the patient perspective and the patient voice. So we just finished last year our IOM consensus study on delivering quality care, and our first two recommendations, and really the whole model is patient-centered. But one of the big challenges that we have with so few people being treated on a new drug with really, I think, inadequate patient-reported outcome data, and non-representation of the population who's going to get the drugs, mostly people over 65 who do not participate in these trials, and we have no post-marketing data from the companies that's responsible in any way. So we go out there and we say, oh, well, in this limited trial of 150 or 200 patients, these were the toxicities, but then you treat somebody with a little bit of renal impairment or a little bit of cardiac impairment, and they're in the hospital, and they have much more morbidity, and we don't really have the data in having that conversation with the patient to get their values and preferences and discussing cost to really give them honest information. And I think that's what's really lacking. And for the pharmaceutical industry to market these drugs with inadequate information about this, I think is a major flaw in the whole system. So how can we solve this problem? Because when they come to us and detail the drug and say this is the next best thing to sliced bread, they don't have any data that's meaningful to us in practice.
And I think that's an important comment. And I would just tell them that you think it's not important. And I would tell you to vote with your prescriptions, because ultimately you have that power. And if you don't think it's significant, that's one thing. But there's other things other than just efficacy in terms of unmet need, available treatment options.
Yeah, but if the patient doesn't like my honest discussion of the situation, they're going to find a doctor down the street who will give them the drug for whatever reason. And so I think, we're limited in our ability to do that. Those of us who practice evidence-based medicine don't have as much flash as somebody who can say, I can cure your disease.
I agree. I think that's a big issue, and I think that's why some of the brave things that ASCO is doing by defining or trying to define value help out. I think that one of the challenges will ultimately be how to frame that debate. And there's companies like Patients Like Me, and the way technology is changing tracking of, let's say, patient experiences, where I think that we may see that change in the near term as you find these communities of people suffering similar disease states. And the example I use is patientslikeme.com, which I own no vested interest in. I have no interest in. But I think that's starting the consumer-led revolution. That's starting the bottom-up revolution, where they start to have more information and we start to understand their side effects. I think it was interesting because Genentech announced a major partnership with Patients Like Me to understand patient unmet needs better and things such as that. I also think that we're starting to see changes in other ways as we start to digitize and find more information. And so I think hopefully that will change. I agree, though, entirely. And I think the only thing that you can do if you think about the levers is continue to stand up for what you believe in, what's right. The system will change. But I also agree with you with the data you cited, that somebody who walked down the street. In our study, 60% of patients said they would switch doctors to obtain a clinical trial drug. But I think this also tells us something about how important we are, or clinicians are, in the scheme of things. Is a $10,000 drug worth it if a patient's willing to walk? If they're willing to walk down the street and switch doctors and all these other things, it just might be worth it. So I think we need to study that more.
Rena Conti, University of Chicago. Thank you for your talk. In a study that myself and some colleagues published a couple of years ago, the single largest predictor of diffusion of cancer drugs was the underlying mortality of the cancer itself. So this suggests to me that people really are willing to pay for a cure. Short of blowing up the patent system, thank you, Lee Newcomer, what do you suggest are the key levers that will incent the incentives that actually produce cures? Thank you.
Well, I mean, and the example is not in oncology, but in HCV, where you're getting cure-like results for what people are finding is an unreasonable price. So I don't know if you'll ever get there. I think, and the anecdote I use is from the time I lived in Europe. I used to speak with payers there, and I said, why are you so hard on drugs? And they said, well, drugs are easier to cut than nurses or hospitals to close. And so the focus is going to remain on drugs regardless of how high we get. If you look at some blood tumors, the survival rates, right, survivorship is now becoming the issue. And so I think that looking at that and looking at what it's going to take to incent cures, there's some things like targets of raising the bar that came out of ASCO, describing what they expected as a clinically meaningful result. I think manufacturers are interested in developing cures. It's just not easy to do. In the same survey that we ran, 52% of patients actually recognized that innovation results in small incremental improvements. And so if we look at the survival curves and what's happened over the last few decades, we have seen great progress in cancer. The problem is I think our perspective needs to change. It's not like a vaccine, right? It's not like an antibiotic, at least yet. But there's a lot of hope out there. So the immunotherapies that everybody's so excited for, you know, it's because of the tail. People are excited at the tail, those people who could actually have a cure. And so the question is, and as you try to price those drugs, what goes into that decision-making process, which I know is, you know, definitely a hot topic and will be over the next couple of years.
Hi, I'm Gwen Darian, cancer support community and cancer survivor as well. And so I mean, there were so many things in this talk that I think hopefully will set up a lot of the discussion as we go forward over the next few hours. But one of the things that is so important, keeps on coming up, is I was really struck by your comment, how much are we willing to pay for hope? Well, where does hope intersect with evidence? And I think we bring that up a lot. And I think that's one of the things that is so critical as we're looking at clinical trials, as we're looking at the very, very limited patient resources to participate in clinical trials. And I think the other thing that's sort of an unspoken thing in this room is who can pay for this hope? So as we look at access to drugs, who has the access to drugs? As we look at the progress we're making in cancer, where are we making progress in cancer? If you know, recently, every 10 years, when statistics are released, African American women do far worse than white women with breast cancer. So I think there's multiple framework for this discussion, and I think we all pay for hope a lot, but I think we have to make sure that we cross that evidence. And I think the other issue that keeps on coming up is this whole notion of insurance. And you know, I have fantastic insurance right now. I'm paying zero for my cancer treatment. I had fantastic insurance 20 years ago. It took me 10 years to pay off my cancer treatment. So it just, you know, this is a really, really critical thing to answer. But I think when we're looking at access, we can't forget that there's across the board access to all the populations that are diagnosed with cancer, and there is that critical intersection of hope and evidence.
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments because I think you hit the nail on the head. There's huge disparities across different racial groups. There's also disparities even from north to south.
Yes.
Even the type of facility you use. And I do think that you were right in how we need to continue to pursue that effort to make sure we don't have disparities. The U.S. is really, really great if you have good insurance coverage and if you have money. It's really bad if you don't. And this is something that's defined the United States for a long, long time. This isn't new, right? But I also think it's not just looking at the price or what we're willing to pay for hope in the sense of preserving death. If you look at the only other thing I can think of, it's the price of life. And if you look at the amount people are willing to pay for IVF, in vitro fertilization, that's a lot out of pocket. And people are willing to pay that. So life and death are two things that I don't think we're going to answer the question. It's certainly not right now, as Dr. Bach is trying to shoo me out.
Looking at you.
But I think it's really well taken that disparities are something that's a tragedy in our country and in this society. The question of how we address that and uncompensated care and other aspects, I think, is really important for us to address.
And I think that as we're looking at what we're willing to pay for life, we have to we have to make sure that we consider that in that discussion, as well as valuing all life in all people who are diagnosed with cancer and impacted with cancer. So.
Thank you.
All right, we are going to, thank you very much, Alex. We're going to break for lunch. We're back in here at 12:15, and I do want to appreciate that what I got out of Alex's talk was why I pay so much for Playmobil toys.